Il primo punto, quando si parla di idea di città che cambia, è chiaro che dobbiamo avere in mente come le città siano molto diverse le une dalle altre. In alcune delle sue interviste, ad esempio LANDRY cita Helsinki, Bilbao, e quindi è chiaro che Helsinki e Bilbao appartengono a una certa categoria di città, quantomeno utilizzando il parametro della dimensione della città. Non si tratta di Mexico City e nemmeno di New York o Parigi, quando Bilbao e Helsinki sono per esempio più assimilabili anche alla dimensione di città come Genova. Quindi c'è questo elemento, questo primo elemento. La dimensione della città però in una dimensione storica in cui, guardando al nostro mondo, assistiamo sostanzialmente, detto in maniera molto schematica, al passaggio dalla, ormai avvenuto, larghissimamente avvenuto, dalla città industriale alla città post-industriale. Quindi questo è il contesto storico in cui noi andiamo a vedere poi tante realtà urbane diverse. Altro elemento importante in una storia in piazza che parla di cultura è il nesso nella città creativa tra cultura e città. Ci sono delle riflessioni importanti da sviluppare che riguardano la cultura dello spazio urbano, il rapporto poi tra la cultura dello spazio urbano e la cultura nello spazio urbano. Quindi gli spazi della città per la cultura, e da questo punto di vista gli spazi della città per la cultura hanno poi delle possibili declinazioni sia per quanto riguarda le culture di massa, sia per quanto riguarda anche il rapporto con l'economia, il turismo culturale, sia per quanto riguarda il tema della cultura e dei valori civili, della civilizzazione in generale, e anche della cultura e della democrazia. LANDRY si è soffermato poi su un altro aspetto importante, che è quello della città multiculturale, e questa è un'altra delle sfide della nostra epoca. La multiculturalità nella città è un dato di fatto, è un elemento al tempo stesso che evidenzia le trasformazioni in atto e che costituisce un elemento di straordinaria ricchezza potenziale anche nella nostra Italia, che conosce questi fenomeni con un decalage cronologico rispetto a quando si sono manifestati in altri paesi europei o nordamericani significativo, ma che comunque vive a distanza di anni fenomeni che presentano, pur nella diversità dei contesti storici, delle analogie forti. In ultimo, LANDRY suggerisce un'idea che mi sembra, almeno per me, molto interessante, quella che in inglese chiama di civic urbanity, senso civico-cittadino, in cui si guarda a due aspetti che devono essere tenuti insieme. Da un lato il diritto del singolo alla città, alla possibilità di fruire della città, degli spazi urbani, quindi un diritto individuale del cittadino. Dall'altro la responsabilità che ciascuno deve avere nei confronti della città. Quindi quelli che nella nostra Costituzione sono i diritti e doveri del cittadino, anche in rapporto alla città. Il diritto allo spazio urbano, a uno spazio urbano di qualità, fruibile, che sia elemento di cultura cultura urbana, ma cultura in generale, e dall'altro lato la responsabilità che ciascuno di noi ha nei confronti della città. Si parla molto di beni comuni, io considero che la nostra città, i suoi palazzi, le sue strade, i suoi musei, ma lo spazio urbano nel suo complesso è un nostro grande bene comune. Dappertutto, ma in una città come Genova questo ovviamente lo sento in modo particolare, non solo per la funzione che svolgo in questo momento. Anche questo è un elemento importante di una città che vuole essere creativa. Allora avremo tutto il piacere di ascoltare Charles LANDRY, che a questi temi ha dedicato anni e anni di lavoro, di riflessione e anche di partecipazione a reti di pensiero condiviso tra studiosi e amministratori. Prego.
Grazie tanto. Mi dispiace per voi, ma parlo inglese perché il mio italiano è come un turista. Okay, now I want to really remind us all that of course cities have always been creative, because cities are places and the laboratories to create the solutions of the problems of their own making. It's just that today we talk a lot about creative cities because we're more self-consciously trying specifically to be creative. So that question of the past is quite significant for me. Now, I think we all know that cities are complex organisms. I know there's a lot of hardware there, but in the end, it's about people doing things. And let's just take a closer look at some of the questions that the Mayor so kindly summarized. And some of the big questions we all know about. The main one is the dramatic transformations that have happened, affecting every Italian city, Torino, Genova. You know, they're all declining in population, and Milano and Roma, the populations are going up. And we know all about that transformation from factories in our countries in the West moving into other places. And of course you can see the implications of that here. I saw this an hour ago, Swarovski selling jewelry and this poor woman begging around the corner. Or this old man playing music, and these young people, of course, one thinks, how are they going to survive? And that is the interesting or difficult challenge for all mayors and others in cities, as is indeed the differences of population. Those three pictures I took within 30 seconds, so you see that all in one simple moment. You can see what is happening in cities. And of course the big shift is that so much wealth creation and prosperity is generated through ideas. And one particular thing that is dominant is of course digitization. We see it everywhere. Everything is digitalized. The city will have sensors everywhere. The way the city looks may be the same, but how it internally operates will be dramatically different. And that transformation, I believe, is deeply transformative, or as it says here, tectonic. And I think these transformations are as dramatic as those of the Industrial Revolution. Remember when the biggest taxi company in the world, Uber, has no taxis. Remember when the biggest hotel chain in the world, Airbnb, has no hotels. Remember when the biggest retailing company in the world, Alibaba in China, has no inventory. Remember when the biggest content producer of media, Facebook, has no media. You produce it, not them. So when that's happening in the world, this is a different world we're facing. And this is just the iconic image from Facebook saying, I like. Now, it is really the volume, velocity, and variety of all of this happening, this information, plus the idea that we can be anywhere, any place, any time, at the same time. And this is quite disruptive of course, for traditional city making and decision making. We all know about these social networks. They're good at one level, but they also have their problems at another. And I took this picture 2 hours ago here in this room, and it's good that old people are also using these same media and communicating as well. But in general, of course, it is the young, the digital natives, as distinct from us, people like me, perhaps Donald too, I don't know, the digital immigrants. And for both of us, these worlds are quite strange. And of course, it is the mobile phone, particularly an Apple iPhone, that is managing so much of all of this. But the negative side is that we become absorbed in it, that we can't actually see clearly anymore, that we are fragmenting ourselves. And perhaps the negative side is also, this is Google showing something in the Sydney Biennale, that Google sucks everything into its own world and controls the information we have. So I'm just reminding us that this is part of the new horizon of cities. And some bits of it are obviously fantastic. The fact that we can find out when the bus is coming, when the train is going, and so on. But when we look at that in the round, we can see that the world is becoming a smaller place. And in that smaller place, of course, young people, people who've got lots of expertise, leave. And the question for a Genova and places like it is, will they come back? And that is the big challenge. How can we make the magnetism of Genova so strong that they don't need to leave, or at least come back? Now, when you add all of these things together, you could say this is a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift only means, like it says in this telescope shop, changing the way we look at the world. And I hope to explore that over the next 30 minutes or so. But the central challenge, the core challenge, is really the management of fragility and complexity, in my opinion. So many things we build up are quite unstable. And in order to manage this, we have to be incredibly alert about this broader horizon, I believe, of what is going on. And my argument in all of this is that it is culture that determines places. The culture of the place, which, as the mayor said, of Genoa is different than of Matera or Bari or Ravenna or Venice. And it is creativity, the imagination of the citizens and organizations that shapes its life. It's like the air we breathe. It's the air of the city. It's, for me, the central resource. But I think a city always needs a bigger aim. And this bigger aim is becoming ever more apparent. And I'm calling it here the civic city. And this civic city has a body language. It behaves in a certain way. And I think it has principles, which we will come to at the very end. But I'm reminded of that lovely saying which Athenian young men, when they became citizens, had to swear by: I shall leave this city not less, but more beautiful than I found it. Or you could say, not less, but better than I found it. And I think that's a fantastic aspiration. Now, of course, the city communicates through every fiber of its being. And when we analyze it, we actually know, without needing to read the paper or listen to the media, what it is about. You know that this image is from the Middle East. I don't need to tell you. I'm not going to tell you where, but you know it's in the Middle East. Everything is about hardware. But you also know, this is in Belgium, that people through graffiti are often telling us how they see the world. Here they say capitalism is chaos, anarchy is order. I'm not saying it's true, but it's a useful thing to look at these signs that we see in the street. Or this image I saw in Torino last week, which said, a life of fighting against ugliness. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But here is the green city of Europe, Freiburg. All of this area is completely carbon neutral. Architects, artists, engineers have worked together to create a different sort of space and place, which is multifunctional, living, working, all together. Or here, Hamburg, where the person cutting the grass, I saw him just finish, decided he wanted to tell you what he thought about the world. Anyway, that's what cities do. And an interesting point for me is that heritage and creativity, or the past and creativity, are wonderful partners. There are masses of examples of how this works. And I'm going to give you one that is strange. This is Košice in Slovakia, the second biggest city. And these are communist blocks. All of these people on your left, on your right, were asked, do you want the original building that used to be here on the top of your building? All of these buildings said no, except for this one. And so therefore the historic building that was in this place is on the top of the roof. It's only a joke, but at the same time, it is one of the main points of attraction and reminds me of that link between heritage and creativity. And so if you summarize that, you could say that creativity, or the imagination, the capacity to think forward, to have foresight, to think afresh, is a renewable resource. It doesn't mean we change everything at every single moment, but being open to its possibility means that it is a resource. And heritage, of course, is a non-renewable resource. And it's precisely that interesting tension that often creates a way forward. For example, you can say that mostly today's classic thing was yesterday often an innovation. So for example, here you see the Eiffel Tower, which was an engineering innovation that we still use today in many aspects. And next to it is a building, which is a hydroponic building, which is about the innovations of the future that we will need to have. So these are just a couple of examples. Now the creative challenge has changed through time. Its trajectory and its aims and its goals have differed. So clearly 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it was issues of public health which were the most important challenge for most cities, and therefore physical infrastructures, sewage systems were incredibly important. Today, of course, this is not Photoshop, this is reality. It's of course issues of climate change which require a creative focus, or how do we live together in difference? These are some of the biggest challenges, as we all know, and the Mayor has already addressed those. But the ambition of every city in dealing with these questions, of course, and in dealing with these questions, of course, they need to have some sense of a picture of where they're going, a story for the city, which citizens can connect to. And what that is about, of course, that story is generating greater footprint for the city, or greater resonance, magnetism, whatever word you want to use. And what it's really coming back to always, all of these things, is the traditional and original purposes of cities, which of course are about exchange, interaction, trade, and so on. So it's all about recapturing those things in a 21st century way. Now, culture. Normally when we talk of culture, we are always saying it in a positive way. And of course, culture can be positive. But of course, as we also know, it's negative. It is, of course, the other invisible hand. There isn't only the invisible hand of the market. The invisible hand of culture drives how a place operates, how motivated people feel to do things. You could say it's the DNA of a place, and it's different in Pisa than in Genova. But when you look at the way cities operate, culture is so often treated partly as an appendage, as that extra thing, or as the cultural department that only deals with art. Whereas I think there's a much bigger version of culture that is stronger, which I think should be the way a city should think. And when one thinks of culture in this bigger way, it's like a currency. It's like a form of capital that can be used when we think of culture in the best possible ways. And I think this is really urgent to make this shift between looking at culture narrowly and looking at it more broadly. And if we start off and think about Genova and think about all the young people I saw in the street, do they feel when they're in Genova that this is a place where they can be curious and where their curiosity is fed? Because if their curiosity is fed, I think what can then happen, because I think curiosity is the starting point, is they may be imaginative. Their curiosity might lead through being imaginative to some interesting solutions and opportunities they might create. Call that creativity. And once these things they've suggested, creative, become an invention, they might ultimately become an innovation. And that process, I think, is what makes a city alive rather than less alive. So really, to summarize a 300-page book in 2 sentences, creative city making is an empowering ethos which enables people to think, plan, and act with imagination in trying to solve issues or problems, or in order to generate opportunities. Now, of course, many people think this is very vague. Isn't it easier to say, let's create 1 kilometer of asphalt and deal with that road? That's practical. Whereas what I'm talking about, of course, is very much about how people, organizations, and the city as a whole think and address the issues they have to deal with. Now, when we look through time, and I think this is the same for Genoa, I often talk about a strategic quartet. And what the culture of creativity of places like Genoa has done, it started very much, I believe, in rethinking public space. And this is something that cities all around the world are doing. This happens to be Malaga. You started this a long time ago, 25 years ago. This happens to be Adelaide Airport. But you can begin to feel already in these spaces that it's more possible for people to connect and be together in some way. The second priority that people began to talk about around 25 years ago was very much, let's bring the artists in, let's bring the artistic imagination in. So we've got public space improvement, artistic imagination, which attracts people, young people particularly, to come to a city, which then cities particularly said, many in Italy, we are cities of learning. Our city is the hub of research and things like that. And that was probably the third priority. We are a city of knowledge, which opens out the possibilities to become, which practically every European city is trying to be, a city which is a startup city, where people can reinvent businesses, given that so many have declined and disappeared. Now, one underlying thing that has been going through all of this through time, and I think it's also true for Genova, is this battle for distinctiveness. Now, I think we all know there are 33,000 McDonald's. I don't know if that's a problem, but anyway, there are a lot of them. And this is Venice. Venice, of course, is unique. This is Naomi Campbell in Venice. This, of course, we have to now get Sisley and others to help us fund the regeneration of Venice. And this is a copy of Venice. This copy is in Las Vegas. Bellagio is in Las Vegas. Everybody in America knows about Bellagio, but not Bellagio on Lake Como, but Bellagio in the copy of Venice. And this is Macau. This is a copy of Venice in Macau. And this is the Grand Canal in the copy of Venice. On the terzo piano, on the third floor, is the Grand Canal, where you can go on a gondola on the third floor in the copy of Venice before you arrive back in Venice to see the copy of the copy. All I'm really saying is being yourself and being confident in your own distinctiveness is one of the most courageous and wonderful things that a city can do. Similarly, Soho, south of Houston Street. Now, there are thousands of Sohos. The Soho coffee shop. In Trieste, l'agenzia di viaggio, Soho. In Trieste, I don't know. If you're in Beijing, of course it's a galaxy, yeah? Because we do things big in China. So again, I'm just saying, central to what we need to do as city makers is remind ourselves to have the courage to be oneself. Now, I just want to go simple. 1, 2, 3. This may be simple, I hope not simplistic. Now, the City 1.0 has something before it, which is 0.0. This is your bourgeois historic city, 0.0. Every city has its past, what it was. This is your more working class historic city, 0.0 in Genova. But what happened in the post-war period was the City 1.0 was too hardware focused. I call it the urban engineering paradigm. And often that generated this ugliness that you see in many graffiti, because there's a lack of aesthetic sensibility. This you will recognize as Dubai. It looks okay on the brochures, but if you actually try and navigate Dubai, it's extremely difficult. Now, I'm not against engineering. I think engineering is fantastic. It's just that we need the other insights, the softer insights of those operating in fields, social, cultural fields, and so on. There's an equivalent 1.0 economy, which is the factory. There's an equivalent culture 1.0, which has a repertoire. And that repertoire is often build the buildings first, the content before the container rather than before the content. And this priority of the hardware might have been essential then, but one really needs to rethink it. The public art is normally red in the City 1.0. It's less green, it's less yellow, it's less blue. And there's a planning 1.0, a management 1.0, which is hierarchical and so on. So many people said, let's wake up, let's think afresh. There must be a different way of thinking this through. And I'm calling this soft urbanism. And soft urbanism is where those dealing with the hard and those dealing with the soft have equal status. Because historically it's very much the construction type people who dominate the thinking about cities. And in this newer phase, the emotional life of the city becomes far more important. But also the way learning works is a bit like, let's build a science park in the middle of nowhere, which I'm not sure is the best thing to do. But it's also the period where we recognize that old factories can be used and reused for the creative economy, and where the new ways of operating and working, like here in Rotterdam, where many companies are in this similar space, is beginning to change the whole office infrastructure of Europe. Since 2008, for many reasons, offices have gone down by 25%, office space, to be substituted by completely different types of spaces and working arrangements. And this new thinking has also shaped museums. This is a textile museum in Tilburg, where the director is not a museums person, but an anthropologist. And this anthropologist said, we will use the old textile machinery to create new products. So you can even rethink museums in this way, less as a place to reflect on the past, but to generate new products and services. Now, you will know that this is the period too where areas become hip, cultural, creative areas like here in Istanbul, the Music Quarter, and they become so popular and gentrify that then Prada decides to buy the buildings because they can pay 5 times as much, and the liveliness and vitality that was generated partly gets destroyed. The same is true about consumption, because this is the period too of buy more, consume more, etc. So that's why Ferragamo in Florence, of course, has to have a museum of shoes and associate it with Marilyn Monroe to create value for shoes. Or in terms of bags, Louis Vuitton is the master of this, linking in this case with the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. This was their best season of selling bags. And so Banksy, the famous graffiti artist, decided to subvert some of the statues in Bristol, just as a reminder that this is all a bit strange. But also, when you look at the public environment, the type of public art we see is more interactive, like here Anushka Kapoor in Chicago, or here the Spanish Jaime Plenza in Chicago too, where 3,000 different Chicago people come up on these images and change every day. So there's the possibility that you will see yourself every few hours. But there is even now probably a 3.0 city. And that 3.0 city has a different sort of feature about what makes it livable. And that is really this combination they're trying to do between the village feel and that sense of being cosmopolitan. And this is where the question of the here-there phenomenon I talked about comes into its own again. It's the place which graphically is not like having one idea, one producer, one distributor to households. It's much more this type of world. Lots of people with lots of ideas coming together in various forms of networks, producing things in strange combinations and distributing their goods and services through various means. I'm only showing you this graphic because it quite dramatically shows the difference between the different worlds we're operating in. So this is this era we are in, where in theory more people can have ideas, which is more based on things like open source, where we share ideas in companies in order to generate collective insight. It's a place where people, like here in Amsterdam, are working in containers. It's a place, like here in Bologna, where you can work anywhere, as here too in Sydney. So this is back to the digitization question I raised at the minute. It's where offices are movable. Everything seems to be on the move, where third places, neither office nor home, become quite dominant and are very significant for the city to provide. It's obviously the place where the mobile is dominant, where often things are very transitional. Things pop up and disappear again. But it's also the place, because of the data we have and the way we can control things, we can suddenly share resources. We can now, this is a picture I took in Torino 3 days ago, where you can share a car, you can share a bike, and you can share a van. The first experiments like this in Amsterdam and Helsinki 15 years ago, people stole the bikes. They just disappeared. But now, because of our phones, we can control where all these bikes are, and they don't get stolen. You, of course, have them too here. I've seen them. But also the negative side, this is New York, Times Square, is that sometimes there's too much information. But you know all about that. Now, the culture of this 3.0 type city, and we need to link 1, 2, and 3 together, the best of 1, the best of 2, the best of 3, is different. It's more focused of creating your own culture. This looks ordinary. For Helsinki, it was radical. On one day, 4 years ago, someone said, it's so difficult to open a restaurant. Let's all open restaurants. And 65 restaurants appeared on the street. It was forbidden in Helsinki. And then the mayor looked at his strategic plan, and it said, we want to be a young, vital, vibrant city. Isn't this precisely the vibrancy we want? And now that's become something the city promotes. TEDx is another version of this cultural exchange we know about, or obviously Facebook itself. So in summary, this city culture 3.0 requires physical transformation. It also has a different operating dynamic than the historical city that we have. Now, we're all in crisis. We're in crisis in Britain too. Don't worry, we talked about crisis, don't worry. Donald knows, I know, we know. And what do you do? So I looked at cities in Europe, which I called places of ambition, who seem to be saying, it's not okay to be okay. And I'm not going to go through every one of these words here, but I'm just going to highlight some of the key conclusions that came from all of these cities across Europe. And the first was to be bold. And that's very difficult when you're in, for example, it's difficult for you to be bold because there are all these pressures on you. The second point I want to highlight is that they have rethought how the bureaucracy could work, how you can make the bureaucracy more flexible and fluid. And they've had a widespread leadership, linking the different sectors somehow together. The other things I just want to highlight that came up are just two. The first is the ability to collaborate across boundaries, getting away from this silo, because we all know that the divisions we have, let's say in a city, environmental, social, in fact, lots of the problems are horizontal. And it's only when we together, collectively think this through, that we come up with the interesting solutions. The other thing that came up very strongly was bipartisanship. We know, obviously, politics and other things, we have different views, but cities that did well seemed to agree at least on a few things that they agreed to agree on, and they might disagree on other things. Finally, in terms of this thing, you can see what I'm talking about is this question of conversation. I want to highlight here just two things. One is allowing both the alternative and the mainstream to coexist, because the alternative movements are often the future mainstream, and that is, in a sense, back to this point that I mentioned about the lifeblood of a city. And perhaps the only other point I want to mention here is having a story to tell your citizens. The citizens know there are problems, but have you, not you, but everybody, all of us, got a story that we can tell that somehow makes them feel it speaks to their heart and mind at the same time? This thing is not moving. So some of the cities we highlighted was Barcelona, not because it did these buildings, new buildings, because of the way it used smartphones with elderly people to solve their doctor's problems so they could communicate with their doctor. But once they learned to communicate with their doctor, they could communicate with their grandchildren. So that was an interesting example. Helsinki, you mentioned I would mention that, is because I think it's incredibly participative. And that allowed the city actually to overcome the Nokia crisis, to become perhaps the startup city of Europe. Malmö we highlighted because of its carbon neutrality, but also in this image here, in the Western Harbour, you have the icon, Calatrava, but this building there is a combination of social housing and middle-class housing. And that mix, to be able to achieve that is quite difficult. And they've done that in several places. We liked also, looking at, I like the Biennale Democrazia in Torino, because we normally think of art biennales. I really like the idea of rethinking democracy too. So perhaps this whole La Storia in Piazza is a version of this ambition you have to have a collective conversation with the city. I mean, it's just simply fantastic that so many people are listening to me talk about cities at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening. You know, you could be doing something more interesting. Anyway, so what all of this is about is harnessing the collective imagination and finding ways to do that. And that normally is not possible within the traditional structures. So how do we measure this pulse of the city? We look at 4 areas. The first is, how do you nurture and identify your potential? And the way you can assess that as a city is to assess how accessible, open your city is, how participative, how good is it as that. Secondly, how is its learning landscape? Not only schools, university, but all of us learning, which is why I think La Storia in Piazza is a fantastic event, and congratulations to whoever invented this. So it's that sort of thing I'm talking about. So this is about being more open than closed. Not 24/7 open, but more open than closed. The second thing we look at is how do you enable and support this potential? And here, it's very much about the political framework. Is the political framework able to say more yes than no? Is it able to find mechanisms to allow new developments to happen? Is there this strategic agility, knowing where you're going, strategically principled, but tactically flexible, because life is never like that. It's always a bit like that. And thirdly, does your city walk the talk? Does it do what it's saying it's doing? The third thing is, how do you harness and exploit that potential? And this is where the city should assess its entrepreneurial capacity. Are there schemes for mentorship? Are there ways of encouraging new companies that are sophisticated, and so on? And the other thing here is, how well does the city communicate with itself and the outside world? So you're both here and elsewhere at the same time. So that's about incubation. And finally, how do you live and express this creativity? Can you see it in the streets? Is this distinctiveness clear to everybody? Is the new places that you're making as good as the old places that you have? And of course, have you got the facilities, hospitals, parks, and so on? So, because we developed this with Bilbao, I'm just showing a picture of Bilbao. Anyway, that's not important. Now, what are the future priorities? And I'm going to begin to wrap up. And I think the future priorities for a city is to say, we are not the best city in the world, but we are the best city for the world. I always say when I'm working with cities, never say, I am a creative city. I always say, try and be a creative city for the world, i.e. giving back in some sense. And this makes me ask some questions in terms of city making. Is this driven by ethics, land value only, or is there some other priority? Another question I ask myself, are property developers and architects always the best city makers? Or are those who understand software, people, all of these cultural things, perhaps better city makers? Because we know, I mean, this picture here is, for example, Paris, again, red public art. Another question I ask myself, is our definition of capital and profit and success broad enough, or is it just a narrow one that only discusses financial value? And is tomorrow's heritage being built today? In short, are we trying to create a legacy now for what we're doing? Another big decision for a city, and I think for Genoa, is very much, and I think you do this, which is you try and do 100 small things well, rather than just say we will have one icon which will be the totality of Genoa. This is Hamburg's big icon. It cost 8 times as much as they thought initially. And finally on this, is this a city of projects, or is the city the project? Very easy to say, difficult to do. And that reminds me, if you look closely at this image, this is Zurich, the new area, and it says Renaissance Hotel. And then there's one building left where an artist in the same writing put resistance. And that is the classic dilemma for all mayors. How do you develop, in a sense, gentrify in a good way, in order to overcome that interesting resistance? So finally, let's talk about some points on civic urbanity. And I want to link that to the UN global process that's going on, which is called The City We Need. And 15,000 people, including in 2 Italian cities, Palermo and Algaro, but also in New York, Melbourne, doesn't matter, Stockholm, had 10,000 people or more discuss what is the city we need to give as a central message to the UN summit in Quito in October. And they connect so beautifully, to me at least, with this civic urbanity thing we've been talking about. And the first is that we have to protect the shared commons, those invisible assets and resources that are often not valued and which people are trying to make us pay for, which could be, we're back to the park. It could be this park with free Wi-Fi where you can do your business. Secondly, cultural literacy. How can we see the world through the eyes of the other in order to try and get the diversity dividend that does exist, but of course, too much diversity obviously creates absorption problems. Thirdly, how does this inclusivity work? You know about the recent reports, Oxfam, 1% of the world owns 99% of resources. In the end, of course, that creates revolutionary situations in many parts of the world. This is a famous image of Sao Paulo, which exemplifies that rich-poor divide. Fourthly, I think intergenerational equity and understanding is key. Too often we assume that the old and the young have nothing in common, and I tend to disagree with that. I suppose because I'm so old now that I have to try and at least both the young and the old like a glass of wine or beer. Anyway, you know what I mean. And then, of course, the fifth is eco-awareness, the thinking, cradle-to-cradle thinking in how you do your economy and everything else. And here I think Hamburg is a great example. The harbour city of Hamburg has wonderful examples. I'm using it because it's a harbour city too, in relation to the green agenda. And then here you can see the word urban planning. But a friend of mine put the word healthy urban planning. And that makes a dramatic difference. If we think of planning that makes you healthy rather than ill, i.e. walkable spaces and so on, it becomes interesting. Now in America I saw something, it said National Walking Day. And I thought, hey, this is amazing. The Americans are walking. National Walking Day. What happened? They were trying to sell me a machine to walk on so they commodified my walking activity because the environment was completely unwalkable. Or here, this is a court of justice, because health is also mental health. This is the building that says you are guilty before you're proved innocent. Yeah? Whereas this courthouse in Adelaide has a gallery as you go up to the judge who might punish you, but at least you're looking at some art on the way. You know, it's a different experience. So you see what I'm getting at. And then I think the word beauty, which is old-fashioned, needs to come back into the urban planning vocabulary. And this is Calcutta, of course, a motorway in front of their best building. I don't want to mention this building. I love it. I don't want to mention that, but let's move on. It wasn't your fault. You didn't do it. I know. It wasn't you. And a quick reminder that one element is this creative city making I mentioned earlier. But the reason that's important is because I think this widening the mind makes us discover hidden potential and resources. So this is really a 360-degree view of operating. And that requires, again, this different form of accounting that I've tried to stress. So the finance ministries need to be different. So finally, it requires a reinvented democracy where we can rethink the rule system in order to make the most of potential. Less the spaghetti of rules, perhaps less rules, more principles, aligning the rules from 1.0 to the 3.0 world, which needs to adapt. Different incentive systems are right for today. They're not the same as we needed yesterday. And that's partly what I mean by the creative bureaucracy. We can discuss that later. So finally, I think it's important to switch the question, not what is the value of everything I'm talking about. I hope we can say, what is the cost of not thinking about art, culture, design, creativity, imagination, ambition. Ambition is the engine, the driving force to make better cities. So all of this is really about the soft. And this has taken me 30 years to work out these 5 words, which is the soft is the hard. The hardware is easy. The soft, I think, is really the hard. So it's less about money, it's more about mindset. Thank you very much.